As Mr. Newcomb explained earlier in his presentation this morning, one of the key components of the World Justice Project is our Rule of Law Index. It is an incredibly valuable tool in the assessment of the strength or weakness of the rule of law in a particular jurisdiction. Our next session of the forum is a presentation on the Rule of Law Index, findings from the Rule of Law Index. And this presentation will be moderated by Zsuzsanna Lonti, Head of Statistics and Indicators, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development from Hungary. Also presenting will be Juan Botero, our Executive Director of the World Justice Project and a Colombian. Alejandro Ponce is the Chief Research Officer for the World Justice Project, and he is from Mexico. I will now ask Mrs. Lonti to please lead the presentation on the Rule of Law Index.
I have a very hard task because I have to follow a panel that was fantastic, but I hope that it will be as interesting as the discussion was at the first panel, because we are getting to the data and we will look at how the countries are faring on the issues that we are talking about. I am leading a project that is called Government at a Glance, where we collect data on how governments are working. And one of the aspects where we don't have our own data is the rule of law. And it will be the first time in this year that we will include the very good work that the World Justice Project are doing on the rule of law. Because we could say a lot of things and we could have lots of anecdotes and we can have a whole history of the rule of law, but we have also learned that it is extremely important that we look at it from a scientific perspective, that we try to measure it, and then this helps countries to see where they are. It helps to benchmark themselves. This is how the publication is presented, comparing yourself to your peers. And what is also very important in the field of measurement, and what is a big strength of the Rule of Law project, is that you have to have a strong theoretical framework that you build your indicators on. And this is what has been achieved by this project, because they have been working with all of you, developing this theoretical framework. And the other strengths of the project is, to me, as a specialist in governance indicators, is that you are participating in developing the framework, but you are also participating in developing the questionnaire, and you are also participating in being experts and answering these questions. And there is no other way that this issue can be approached. And it is also extremely good that there are several experts, lots and lots of experts from each country that are answering the questionnaires. Because in many countries, and especially in countries where there are problems with rule of law, there's also a polarized opinion on what is good and what is bad. So the experts are also polarized. So it's also very good that you have, a group of experts, that these biases can be a little bit overcome. That is very, very important. And so this is also a big opportunity for the project to thank all of you that you have been so much involved in this work. And why the results will be presented, it's really your answers and how it is shown back to you, how you are faring compared to others in the world. And what is really interesting when I started my work on governance indicators, that because I am working on OECD countries, it never occurred to me that the rule of law can be a problem in OECD countries. But I have to tell you that rule of law is and could be an issue in well-developed countries as well. Maybe the problems are different, maybe the emphasis might be different. when I try to include the data into our forthcoming publication, I was afraid that among the OECD countries there will be no variation. Yeah? That countries will be so similar on different aspects of the rule of law. And this is absolutely not true. There is variation. The countries are different and how good they are. And what is also, to me, very, very good about this project is that the differentiation that was made in the previous panel, that there's a difference between the rule by law and the rule of law, that you are also taking a stance and that you are really measuring the rule of law and not the rule by law. These are very, very important issues. And then what you also have to understand that beside what you measure, it's also very important how do you measure it. And to be reliable, to be precise, to be able to avoid biases as much as possible is very important. And the research design, from whom you collect the data, what you ask for them, whether they are answering honestly, whether they really reflect what is happening in the country, it is very, very important. And these are, the small prints that you usually don't read. But how I feel about the World Justice Project, that you are strong on the small print, that we have been starting our work together, so that in the last 6 years you have evolved and you have been continuing to improve, to provide better and better data and also to cover more and more countries. So what is also very important when you see this presentation, that please keep up the good work and please contribute in the future and contribute also to the development of the indicators of what you are looking at and how you are looking at, and involve more and more people in the ground, knowing about the project, knowing about the result, showing it back in the countries, because rule of law is not just an issue in Africa or in Asia, but also in Europe, in the Americas. It is an issue for the whole world. Thank you.
So if it is okay with you, I'll speak from here. Do you hear me well? Okay, thank you. First, Zsuzsanna, thank you for your introduction. It is incredibly meaningful and touching to us to receive such words from you, because after so many years of working in indicators, the work that the OECD does is, of course, some of the most respected in the field and has defined the field to a large extent, as has, I see Sam Mueller in the first row. The commitment to measuring and to adhering to standards is part of what defines the World Justice Project. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. This is a presentation about the rule of law around the world and why it matters, based in large extent on the findings of the Rule of Law Index. I should start by mentioning the Mark Agrast, Christine Pratt, Joel Martinez, Kelly Roberts, who have worked for years with us developing this project. The Rule of Law Index, in a nutshell, is a quantitative assessment tool designed to offer a comprehensive picture of the extent to which countries adhere to the rule of law in practice. It is then a tool to measure adherence to the rule of law, but it is a lot more than that. It starts with a definition that is comprehensive and encompasses all different areas of the rule of law. The quantification of rule of law outcomes obtained from more than 400 individual questions and variables, and the big database. So the book that you have in your hands is better understood as the tip of a very big iceberg of data. But the first element, again, is the definition. The World Justice Project developed through its founder a notion of the rule of law which is based on 4 universal principles. And by universal, as Bill mentioned this morning, we do not mean that everybody should adopt it, but is something that could be applied and apply equally to different cultures. The principles, because of the definitional nature, some aspects overlap among them. Protection of fundamental rights include freedom of speech, but at the same time, freedom of speech is a check on the government balance. So principle 1 and 2 may overlap, and the judiciary is also a check on the government balance. So for definitional purposes, the principles are the way they were presented by Bill this morning. For measurement purposes, we needed to disaggregate the elements of the definition into 4 dimensions of the rule of law, if you will. These 4 dimensions are government accountability, security and fundamental rights, open government and regulatory enforcement, and delivery of justice. These 4 dimensions of the rule of law further disaggregate into 9 factors and 48 sub-factors. These 9 factors that you have in front of you relate to different components of what the rule of law means. Limited government powers is the checks and balances on the government power. Absence of corruption, which is closely related. These 2 compose the principle of accountability. Order and security and protection of fundamental rights. Then open government and regulatory enforcement, and civil, criminal, and informal justice. Using informal to catch customary justice and different forms of justice in the world. If you open your books in page 11, you will see that how these 9 factors disaggregate into the 48 sub-factors. I want to stop for a second and invite you to consider the implication of this in light of the conversation that we heard in the fantastic panel earlier in the morning. And to answer some of the questions that were raised, I heard nobody can disagree with obeying the law, but the law can say anything. That is true. And one of the missions of the World Justice Project is to make it clear, to try to explore it collectively, not to dictate from above, among all of us to explore it and develop collectively the understanding of what the rule of law means. And the rule of law does not mean the law. The rule of law does not mean the thin definition of simply adhering to whatever the law says. It was a reflection in history. Europe, in some point of time, walked away from the notion of divine universal principles and adopted the notion of positive law as the source of authority. This positive law as the source of authority led to the belief, which was discussed in the Nuremberg trials, that I was simply obeying the law. This is not rule of law. So the notion of protection of fundamental rights is a fundamental component in itself of the notion of the rule of law. Otherwise, it is ruled by law. And of course, it ties as well to the discussion on the tyranny of the majorities. And while I greatly appreciated, Santiago, your insights and innovative thinking this morning, I also like to point out, in the same vein, that that type of reasoning without the proper understanding of the checks and balances in the society may lead to abuses and to homicide and to Holocaust. And we see our honorary chair, the Chief Justice of the Justice of Gambia, now Chief Prosecutor for the tribunal in Rwanda, can and has in the past taught us the perils of not having grounded understanding of this fundamental play by the rules and rules that are fair, that apply to all, but also protect the rights of minorities. This is what we understand for the rule of law. And for measuring purposes, page 11 gives you the list. How do we measure? As Zsuzsanna pointed out, and this made my day, what she said about the small print, because that's ultimately the difference between, this is the same discussion that we were having this morning. Produce an indicator takes 5 minutes. You download a couple of pieces of data, you put them together, you find a nice printer, put a glossy cover, and you have an indicator. That's not the work that we have been trying to do for so many years. It is in the absolute commitment with the way the data is collected, and many of you have contributed to that effort in many different ways, in which the outcome is based. And that is a general population poll. It's a probability sample of 1,000 respondents per country in the 3 largest cities. And it is expert questionnaires completed by in-country experts in civil and commercial law, criminal justice, labor law, and public health. 2 notions are important to highlight here. One is the notion of triangulation. We triangulate sources of data. We triangulate perspectives. So the notion of the rule of law that we are measuring is how the rule of law affects Joe or Jane Doe walking in the streets of Mexico City. This perspective of how the law affects a person has some blind spots because there is aspects that the person doesn't deal with, for instance, sophisticated finance. However, it relates directly to the fundamental recipient of the rule of law, who is responsible for upholding it, which is the ordinary citizen. So to get at them, we go and identify a random sample of citizens in the 3 largest cities. This means, for those that do not know, do not work in the field of statistics, it means that every person in the 3 largest cities should have the same probability of being interviewed. This creates data that can be extrapolated to the general population of these 3 cities. In addition, to triangulate a different perspective, we contacted and interviewed over 2,500 experts in 97 countries. The perceptions, the experience, and the perspectives of these sources of data get together in defining the aggregation of the variables. And for those who want to see the small print, here below is a working paper which describes the list of variables and how exactly things are measured. I want to focus for a second on this picture, because it seems to me, Alex, that we have presented this, and Mark, I would say more than 100 times by now. And still, it is very difficult to convey this idea. The idea that, what is it that we measure? How the state affects or interacts with individuals, and individuals interact among them. in these basic dimensions in the cities of these countries. How we measure it? We ask the citizens. We ask them, did the police beat you last year? Did you have a dispute with someone? What did you do with that dispute? Did you go to court? What happened in court? Did they ask you for a bribe? These everyday situations that compose the rule of law, because I'm quoting Justice Kennedy here. The rule of law is not the law. Justice Chaskalson, who was one of our beacons and honorary chairs, said it clearly in Forum 1 in Vienna. The rule of law is a culture, is in the minds and hearts of the people. Is these people. That's the rule of law. Is not the laws on the book, is not a series of concepts. The rule of law is the community that we have under Bill's leadership been building for almost 7 years now, in which many of these familiar faces today represent the highest achievement for the World Justice Project. In addition, going back to the small print, the statistical unit of the European Commission's Joint Research Center conducted an audit of the index, statistical audit, which you can see in page 119. Let me walk, for many of you this is familiar, you've heard it 5 or 6 times, I apologize. For some of you, this is new. If you go to the books in page 58, you see how to read the country profiles. The country profiles have 2 parts. One part is the table in the top. This table provides data on the representativeness of the scores by providing data on the cities, and it provides comparative scores and rankings by region and income level on the 8 factors that are compared across countries. We also measure factor 9, which is customary justice or informal justice, but since you cannot compare a shaman with a chief, with a jirga, it is measured to use as internal comparison with the formal justice system in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, or in Colombia, but not to compare Liberia with Colombia. So the comparable factors are the first 8. And the second part of the country profile has 4 circles, and these circles represent dimensions of the rule of law: accountable government, security and fundamental rights, open government, regulatory enforcement, and delivery of justice. In each one of these circles, each of the radius is one of the sub-factors. And these sub-factors, the black or dot at the end, is the best performing country in the world. So the outer side of the circle, the periphery of the circle, is a score of 1. The center of the circle is a score of 0. So in this case, Brazil has a score very high in this factor, very low in this one, because Brazil is the purple line. The orange line and the green line represent the relative comparisons, which are, of course, limited and imperfect, of regional peers and income level peers. But the purple line represents the country. So for this one, each one of the indicators, you see, ultimately the size of the shape of the shape inside represents adherence to the rule of law. However, it is important, as Alex will mention later, not to be misled by that, because the relation between rule of law and economic development skews or drives much of the situation. So it is important to consider the absolute scores, but also consider scores in relative context. So both are important in relative context to compare with countries of the same level of development or income per capita as a proxy of that, and regional peers. So let me walk you for a second about the Mexico scores. Mexico is, here are the 8 factors, and I want to call your attention to open government, Mexico ranking 8 out of the upper middle income countries, 8 out of 30, so very high, and ranking 29 out of 30 in the factor of criminal justice. This means that in relative terms, as compared to its peers, Mexico does very well in delivering open government, and not so well in delivering effective criminal justice. If you go to the delivery of justice slide, and I am leaving out the good news, but focusing on this particular aspect for the sake of time, you see that still the criminal system is free of improper government influence. So judicial independence in Mexico is high from the point of view of absence of interference from the government. It's relatively high. It's not all the way here, where probably the Netherlands is. But it is here, which is much higher than these red dots that I'm calling your attention at the bottom, which is the effectiveness of the correctional system and the timeliness of the investigation and adjudication, where Mexico's performance is significantly lower according to this data. How do we get to this picture? Again, we ask a random sample of citizens in Mexico's 3 largest cities questions that affect this type of issues. Then we ask criminal experts in Mexico, a variety of them. We assemble that into sub-factors and the factors, and that's the outcome of this. So this is best understood again as the tip of an iceberg. When this was released, it went in the press all over the country. This is the Chief Justice of Mexico discussing the findings of these results. And it shows something important. It proves the second point. Civil society in Mexico has been incredibly active. They are not satisfied with the results. They want to do better, and they are meeting and advancing in very fast speed changes that will lead to a better, more effective criminal justice system in short time, is my prediction, because of what they are doing. Part of what they are doing, you see in some of the Opportunity Fund grantee, one of them is the organization that produced this documentary, which was produced by civil society, a winner of an Emmy and many other awards. This was seen by, I think, 30 million people. And this ties back to the conversation about the people and how they change things. And as committed as the Mexican authorities and the highest court are to improving situations in the country, still some of the obstacles to that are also exemplified by the fact that this movie has not been allowed to be played in the country. Of course, another point here, very simple. Problems are not limited to developing countries. We have highlighted issues in the United States, such as unequal access to justice in low-income communities. And every country in the world has something to do. Let's move fast, because I have taken more than I anticipated, to review the status of the rule of law in the world. This map represents an aggregation of the 8 factors. You see great variations. But sometimes the aggregated scores hide the details behind them. And the details is that China, Vietnam, and Malaysia score high on security, but low on checks and balances, whereas Indonesia scores high on checks and balances, but low on corruption. So the same aggregated score may picture 2 different realities. And sometimes they provide an indicator, and it is important for those factors. I will just go quickly, showing that the variations around the world are very significant. And let's focus on, and I will invite you to go through all the 97 country profiles to get a more detailed picture. Let's focus on India. Let's see that the point I was making earlier, every country has positive and negative aspects in this. This is one of the things that we've learned after 7 years of doing this. India in freedom of assembly and association, freedom of opinion and expression, outperforms regional income peers. As it does on limited government powers, checks and balances, including non-governmental checks on the government power. These things are obviously related. However, in the issue of absence of corruption in the legislative branch or in the executive branch, or on delays in administrative proceedings, India is very close to the center of the circle. And it seems that this situation may relate to this one. So proceedings are slow, maybe because corruption appears to be very significant. And let's focus on one case. Official information is available, because this ties to what we are doing in this meeting. What we are doing in this meeting is building a network to advance the notion of the rule of law and incubating programs to advance the rule of law. This is what we are doing in this meeting. So let me tie it to this point. Official information is available, factor 5.4. You see that India outperforms income and regional peers. When you see the number and the graph, what does this mean? Let me tell you what this means. It means that this is the right to information loss from the Global Right to Information Rating, which measures the quality of the laws in the books. So how effectively the laws include the protection of the right to information in countries. And in this, you will see that India is perhaps the best performing country in the world, because in large part because of this woman, recipient of the 2011 World Justice Project Rule of Law Award, Aruna Roy, and many other Indians worked to pass some of the most comprehensive and best legislation of freedom of information in the world. So, in this dimension, India is performing much better than most countries in the world. However, when you check access to information in practice, as measured by factor 5.4 of the index, which is we went out and asked 1,000 people if they really have access to information, what you find is that India, well, is not red or black, but it's not green either, like Sweden. So effective access is not the same as access in the law of the books. Having an effective access to information law is the first fundamental step. And India has taken it, and if we had seen this picture 5 years ago, it would have looked very differently. However, still a lot way to go if you ask a random sample of the population if they effectively have access to information as compared to other 100 countries. And for those that are statistically oriented, this is the law in the books, this is the law in practice, access to information, no correlation. Let me finish with an indication. These are other opportunity fund grantees. This is Bribe Hackers. They are working to advance the access to information in India and attacking corruption. Access to information, many other, attacking corruption. These issues that are highlighted here. But they have had difficulties in moving forward because the procedures to advance the process are so slow because of the same cause that they are trying to combat. But what they are doing is they are implementing mechanisms to advance that. The case will be presented tomorrow, so I'm not gonna, I think the expression is jinx it or I don't know, by telling about them today, but I call your attention on this presentation. Secondly, this is the 50-50 group of Sierra Leone, whose presentation will also come tomorrow. And they are doing concrete actions to advance the rule of law. This is what the morning of tomorrow will showcase, is what each one of all of us can get together with other disciplines, with other people in our own community, to incubate a program, be it translate the laws and on gender violence and take it to the community, be it advanced registration cards for people access to health, be it, the list is enormous in our library of programs in the webpage. This is what we're here for, and I thank you very much for your attention. With this, I yield to Alex.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, everybody. The title of this presentation was The Status of the Rule of Law Around the World and Why It Matters. I think just Juan tried to summarize as much as possible the status of the rule of law. It's difficult. I think probably the best way to do that is just check the book, just check your country, check the indicators. This is backed by data, thousands of interviews to people, and summarized in the book. So I invite you to use it as a tool to investigate the situation in each one of the countries. Of course, this is just a limited tool. It looks at the issues at 10,000 feet. But it's a useful tool. It provides a framework. Once we have measured this, probably one question that we should ask before is why in the first place rule of law matters? Does it matter? How does it matter? So probably in this room, everybody agrees that it matters. And we hear all the time that we should strengthen the rule of law and that the rule of law is important and so on. The problem is that if we don't understand exactly what that means, and if everybody's just talking about this vague concept, then it's really difficult to see the channels by which it matters. What I'm going to try to do right now is definitely not answer this question because this is a very complicated question, but just simply give you a tease of some examples of why it matters to us and what particular components matter to us. So for that, let me just start with summarizing a little bit of the framework without just going and repeat what Juan said, but just seeing it from another perspective. I see just things differently, so this may be useful. Just think for a moment that there is a group of people in an island, like that one. Nice, no? It would be nice to be there. So there is a group of people in that island, and suddenly they find themselves there in the island. And one guy says, you know, what we need is a leader. Okay, fine. So we'll have a leader. And then we have some other people there. And then the people ask, well, why do we need a leader for? And the guy says, well, you know, we have to protect ourselves from animals. We have to protect ourselves from ourselves. We have to put some rules so that we can live in a peaceful society. Okay, fine. So then you're going to provide security, so you're going to gather a group of people who are going to provide security, and at the same time you're going to provide some rules just to avoid conflict so that we don't get into each other's lands and so on. Fine, perfect. What else? Well, it turns out that I know people and there will be conflict. So I'm going to provide, as the leader, 4 mechanisms for solving disputes. And if someone actually breaks the rules, then we're going to punish that guy. So that's civil justice, criminal justice, as well as mechanism for redress grievances, informal justice. And the people say, wow, that's great, this guy is great. So, but then they realize, hold on, this guy, is he really going to comply with all these things? I mean, this guy has the power, just to provide the security and so on, so probably we should just put some restraints on this guy. And they say, you know,
we're going to put some checks on you. You're going to be accountable to us. And since you're going to be managing the money, right, because you promised us to build some nice fences to protect us from the animals, we have to check that you actually use the money just wisely and do not take it for yourself, right? At the same time, we have to be sure that you're not going to use the force against us and you're going to protect our freedoms and we're going to just do not abuse our rights. And finally, we want to have a voice in what you are going to do. So we want to participate in the decisions that you make. So that story is the framework that is behind the factors of the index. So the sub-factors and all the things that you will see in the abstract is just this simple story in which how even basic societies operate. Obviously, this is an ideal, because we know that in some societies, that guy is going to be more powerful and is going to collude with the other guy and may have incentives just not to work together and so on. And that's why we end up with different outcomes in different countries in the world. But if those ideals are actually held, you see it's much more likely that the guys in this island are going to prosper and are going to be peaceful. So that's the idea of this ideal of the rule of law. So what I'm going to present right now are just some pieces of evidence just of how each one of these elements, how to think about these elements and how they matter into some of the basic things that we deal on just in our daily lives. So this is a chart of the rule of law and GDP per capita. Just basically shows a positive relationship. This is just the scores of the index as well as just the income per capita. We know there is a positive relationship saying richer countries usually have more rule of law, right? There is a positive association on that. What is interesting is that income is not everything. We have countries at the same level of development with different levels of rule of law. Ghana and Cameroon, for instance. So there is room for making things. It's not only that we have to grow and then rule of law is just going to get fixed, right? So there is room for things. So just let's think about why rule of law matters from different perspectives. Let's think that for a moment you are an investor and you're considering where am I going to put my investment? So in making that decision, I probably need to take into account, well, what's the cost of labor? What is the possible market size? In general, what are the costs and benefits so that I can calculate my return? But in calculating these costs and benefits, there are very important things that we have to take into account. We have to take into account, for instance, when calculating the costs, well, what about if there is crime and I get my trucks stolen? Okay, that's going to be costly. What about if I have to bribe government officials just to get things done? That's going to be more costly. What about if just suddenly the authority comes and expropriate my stuff? Oh, okay, so then it's risky, my investment. So the returns may be lower. This chart, for instance, shows just the average index score just of the top 10 recipients of foreign direct investment by each one of the different sectors of the investment, so where the investment is going. So primary investment, for instance, primary foreign direct investment is extractive industries. For extractive industries, it's not very necessary, the rule of law. We just simply take the resources, and that's fine. Secondary industries, usually you require more rule of law because there is much more investment, because we are going to manufacture things in a certain country. We're going to put plants there, so we need more rule of law. Tertiary investment, well, we're going to build services there. We're going to build hotels. We need good rule of law. So what we see is that just in general, just by type of investment, countries usually the type of foreign investment that is like much more, in which much more resources are committed, just require a higher rule of law. Obviously, this doesn't show much of this is an association, but there are research showing, for instance, just at the level of firms, just showing how just from going from a country like Azerbaijan to a country like Estonia in terms of corruption can increases the probability that firms are going to invest by 15%. So these things just matter. So another example, just think that you are in the transportation business and you have to ride or drive just in the rules of the country. And then you have to pay bribes to every single police in the country. They stop you, you have to pay a bribe. Well, this is costly. Indeed, there was a guy who actually just accounted for all these things. And it turns out that in Indonesia, for instance, just the cost of bribes is 13% of the cost of transporting something. Just as a comparison, just paying the driver is only 10%. So it's much more expensive. These kind of things matter as well. If we ask just businessmen, so these are results from the World Competitiveness Report, just on what are the main impediments for doing business in the countries. This is Sub-Saharan Africa, and you cannot see what it's in there, but that is corruption. In Middle East, red tape and corruption as well. In Latin America, red tape, corruption, and crime. And these are among the top impediments for doing business in the country. So these kind of things are important. Now, this is not only important for businesses. This is important for us because we also invest just in the financial sector or in our houses. This is, for instance, a study that was done in Argentina in which when the government gave squatters land rights, they improved by 40% the investment in their homes. If they have a title, if they know that they can rely on the law, so they are much more likely to invest in the roof, in the walls of their houses. Now, rule of law is also important for public service delivery. It's not only important for investment, and we can see some examples. This is again a cross-country progression on rule of law outcomes and infant mortality rates. Just same story, just countries with better public health or better health just have higher scores on the rule of law. And this actually just holds, we have done exercises, this holds even controlling for income, for inequality, public expenditure, and so on. But just imagine, I mean, just what kind of a quality, what will be the quality of the health if you have to just pay a bribe, or if just some of the resources are misused, or if the doctors simply do not show up. Just they are paid, but they simply do not show up. Another example, another interesting study done in Brazil, which basically just the Brazilian government audited some random municipalities just to check the level of corruption, and they did reports. Then some guys actually analyzed what were the test scores of the children in those municipalities that had corrupt governments. And the children's score worst. And when they actually went and checked the resources, it turns out that in those schools, that even though they should have, they didn't have computers, or the teachers didn't receive training, and so on. So that actually affects the outcomes of our children. Another issue, crime. Well, obviously there are direct effects of crime for victims, just physical, psychological, which can be very, very harmful and expensive. But there are other effects as well. Crime reduces investment. Crime even reduces government expenditure, because the government has to move resources to fighting crime. Just even affects educational outcomes of the people living in neighborhoods with high crime, because they actually have they have incentives, so they are much more likely to join gangs. So all these things matter. Participation, another example. So why participation matters? Well, participation makes just the kind of decisions more legitimate. Just people are happier if they are able to raise their voice and participate in the decision in the decision process. This is a case in Indonesia. So this does not only affect other outcomes, health, education. Just the rule of law interacts, the different components of the rule of law interact with each other. What we're seeing here, for instance, is crime and the criminal justice system. Just not surprisingly, in those cases in which the criminal justice system doesn't perform, just crime is much higher. Of course, the channel, I'm not trying to say just first fix rule of law and then we'll have the other outcomes. Just the relationships are much more complex. And just another study, for instance, just in general, if you have more educated people, the people actually just complain more, report more crimes, report police abuses, go to court more. So actually all these channels matter as well, just to fix the rule of law. This is more, rather than a linear relationship, this is really more of what we see. Just everything interacts with each other with arrows going from one side to the other. Probably the best way to think about this is as a forest, in which there is a system in which the tree requires from the animals and so on. So there are relationships on both sides. So just with these simple ideas, I would like to say just, well, how the rule of law impact our lives? Well, we have seen different channels. What we have seen is that it's really the backbone of a prosperous and stable society. Just perhaps one way to think about this, and let me just go back. I'm an economist, so the way that I think things sometimes is a little bit different. So perhaps the first answer to why it matters is, well, is there demand for it or not? If people assign value, then there is demand for it. What we have seen in the last few years is demand for rule of law. We have seen movements all over the world in which people just go out to the streets to ask for rule of law. So it matters. It matters for them. So we have seen it, the Arab Spring, just asking to fight corruption. Argentina, asking for accountability. Mexico, fighting for crime. What we have seen as well is just a movement. Just we're living today in a society in which, just as Santiago was mentioning before, just the world is much more communicated. But it's not only that. What we have seen is just during the last few years, just the most successful story of economic development. We have seen just people lift out of poverty. We have seen people that are becoming more educated. We have seen an incredible rise of the middle class. A class that is not the elite that can make a deal with authorities. It's just a class that benefits the most from having clear rules and a rule of law society. So these are the kind of people who are demanding this. And they are demanding this in very different ways. Santiago was talking about the internet, but there are many other ways. Just in the case of Mexico, for instance, the civil society has been organized just after all these movements, which is really a hand-waving exercise, but requires something more, requires organizations to come up and propose something. And that's what we have been seeing in the last few years. Just we're not in the top-down approach of 20 years ago. Right now we're living in a world in which everybody has something to say, in which people can organize easier, in which organizations can actually raise their voice and just put proposals on the table. So I think that's the reason why you guys are here, just to advance the rule of law from the different aspects of the society. This is not only just a meeting of government officers. This is a meeting of all the society, of all the disciplines, because all of us are stakeholders of the rule of law. So with that, I'm just going to finish my presentation. Thanks.
I would like to open now the floor if you have any questions. Yes, we we will need a low time to get the microphones and the people helping us. Just a second, because we will need the microphone to give it to you. There are several people who... Yeah.
Does this microphone work? No. Yes.
They are bringing...
Yes.
So please also say your name and where are you from?
I'm Kiran Bedi from India. Since you presented the Indian's case study, I thought I'll give you a little background. Last 2.5 to 3 years, we were a part of a massive India Against Corruption movement. It was based on the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, which had made it mandatory for Indians, for ratifying, all those countries who were ratifying to come up with an anti-corruption law. India till then had a very weak law. And when the UNCAC was ratified by the Indian Parliament, having developed a nexus to stay the way they were, and elected representatives were calling we the people, they came up with a law which was actually maintaining a status quo. So we, the civil society, woke up against it and said we will not accept a dud law. We want a law which is in letter and spirit of the UNCAC Convention. Now what I believe, my friends, is what I would like to look at the parameters you had, is one more parameter for consideration, is participatory lawmaking. Do we think that the elected representatives alone are the custodians of lawmaking? Because in the end, they become a political party. The political party goes into the hands of the very few, and then they, under the election laws, issue a whip, and they have to go by the party ideology, not by what the civil society wants. I would want, for consideration of the World Justice Forum, to consider including one more parameter of the law assessment, is how participatory has it been beyond the elected representatives who may have become a nexus by themselves, as it happened in India, and it's still a vital issue. At the moment, the matter is before the Supreme Court of India, which is compelling Supreme Parliament, which is called the elected representatives, who have formed a law which is actually in violation of letter and spirit of the UNCAC. One more parameter to judge whether the law, the rule of law, whether the law meets the needs of civil society, as it is happening in India. I think that would then compel participatory democracy of from we the people in totality, and not we the elected. It is we the people, because it's we the elected who are finally now deciding, which is almost going contrary from we the people. So I think that's a very important matter, is how participatory has it been. Now look, there may be formal, stupid ways of going to we the people. They could have an area convention, they could have a seminar, a closed door, and then walk away with it. I think we need to add one more parameter for this rule of law to judge whether the law was truly democratic and participatory. Thank you.
Thank you. Because we are out of time, I was instructed that I can take like 3 questions. So now I would like to get from the middle. Yeah. Please.
I'm Bodhularam Mujumdar from Bangladesh. I think in your index I see one thing missing. The example you used of the island. People decide to have a leader, but leader doesn't last forever. Leaders will have to be re-elected, changed. So is the system of electing leader, is it fair? Is it inclusive? Is it just? So in other words, what I would like to recommend that you consider including electoral justice as one of the criteria. Thank you.
Thank you. And then from here, please.
much. I'm Juan. I participate as the director of the Academy of Human Rights and Transparency for Good Governance. I want to say, I have a question. The rule of law is about equality, and in some cases, legal equality promotes inequality. For example, if we tax a person with 20% of his monthly income, then if the person earns 600 euros, he remains with 480. If the person earns 600,000 euros per month, he remains with 480,000. This is the inequality towards the law. It's the phrase of Anatole France, who had said the law is equal towards everybody. Rich people as well as poor people are forbidden to sleep under a bridge. By studying the index, I noticed that there's not a notion of this factor within the index. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I take one or two more? Just on the, yeah?
I noticed you lumped the Caribbean with Latin America. We're totally different. You need to separate both groups if you are to get valid data. The only country you have from the Caribbean is Jamaica. And you're comparing Jamaica to Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina. You need to compare Jamaica to Trinidad, Barbados, countries that are culturally and legally the same, have the same sort of Commonwealth system. So I think you'll get flawed data if you continue that way.
Thank you. One more here, please. If you would. Interesting suggestion.
Hi. My name is Eva Noom from China, Beijing. I'm director of Asian Center for Law and Culture. I remember when all of law students in college was taught that rule of law cannot be achieved unless certain economic education conditions met. So I think it's widely believed among the Chinese lawyers that only when the education economies has reached certain level, and the government's not going to do a lot of things on rule of law. So I think the logic is completely opposite from what you have presented. So I would like to know what's your opinion, what's your answer on that? And second, I'd really like to know, is it possible to have a country, a free country, without rule of law, but civil society? So I think for China, 5,000-year history, we really never had rule of law, but we do have a blossoming civil society right now existing. So I'd like to, see your opinion on, is it possible that it's like Singapore, it's not completely rule of law, but because of civil society, the country still can be identified as a free country. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the last, please. The gentleman.
Thanks very much. Professor Amir Ataran from the University of Ottawa. Quick question, what do your data say about the correlation, if any, between the rule of law, economic growth, and economic equity in growth, as measured by things like the Gini coefficient?
Okay. I'm sorry I cannot have more questions, and then I would like the two of you to answer, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Zsuzsanna. Thank you, all of you, for your questions. I'll try to be very brief in answering them. Some of them I will just leave for you, Alejandro. We will try to answer all of them. Civil society. That's what I meant when I said the rule of law is culture. It's not whether you have a constitution where it's written and it has 300 articles. It's whether the culture in which this constitution is implemented includes the idea of adhering to a set of rules. And that is embedded in history. And that can be taught, as we will discuss this morning, and Justice Kennedy presented yesterday, and is being taught, and fundamental changes are happening in the world throughout in this regard right now, as we speak. The participatory democracy. We do have questions and variables and that feed into factors 1 and 5 on open government and on checks and balances on the government power, which relate to whether the citizens have the capacity to influence the process, to request information from the process, the right to petition, that relate to participatory democracy. And this relates to the discussion earlier this morning on participatory democracy. The notion is perhaps a 17th century idea for the 21st world. But still, like in the Ratatouille movie, maybe everybody can cook, but cooking well requires some degree of checks and balances. And so some of that is addressed in the index. Transition of power, the electoral justice, 1.7, factor 1.7 relates to whether transition of power occurs in accordance with the law, which speaks to the electoral justice question. I think I will leave the economic questions for you, Alex. Out of time.
Okay. Just very briefly on the participatory, actually, we have questions on the part of open government, on whether people, and we actually have questions that we ask the people whether they are able to participate when there are processes, or whether there are just public works, I mean, whether people are asked and so on. I mean, just not to the level of asking just particular laws, but we have a dimension of that. Just on the question on equality of taxes, we have I think to a certain extent what is in the law, different societies may decide different things on what they consider how the law should, what the law should say regarding equality. What we measure and what we consider there is a fundamental part of the rule of law is that the same law has to be applied equally to all the people. So regardless of what the law says, it has to be applied equally. And we have some, we quantify that in one of the factors, or factors on discrimination. Regarding the question on Jamaica, we actually include as well Dominican Republic, but I see the point. I mean, Dominican Republic has a different legal tradition and so on. I see the point as well of including smaller islands as well. We at some point this year wanted to include Haiti. We're figuring out whether we can do it. Regarding the question on whether certain economic conditions are a prerequisite for the rule of law, just probably the most basic things are necessary, in a sense, probably just that there is no war or no civil conflict. But something that we have seen is just even in very poor societies can still advance parts of the rule of law. So we have seen examples like Ghana or Botswana, which Botswana 30 years ago was in the same income category or had the same income as Zambia. And today is a country with high rule of law, is a country at the same levels of countries like Uruguay or Chile, or even some developed economies, and is growing towards economic development. So it's not necessarily the case. And that's why I said when I talk about this, I said this is not a linear relationship. This is not that we need this in order to have this. It's a system. We need both things, and both things are interacting all the time, and the different components that we have are interacting all the time. So we may just increase one component and reduce the other one, but all the things are moving together to a certain extent. Just on the issue of correlation on economic growth and inequality, just the particular question, we have not done it on the issue of actually growth rates, and we have to be careful in doing this exercise because obviously just economic growth depends on many other things. Just the rule of law is one determinant, but it's not the only one. There are many other things that matter, and it's really difficult to disentangle what is exactly the effect of the rule of law. We don't really have the counterfactual of saying without rule of law what would be the economic growth. So it's really difficult to look at these issues.
Then, as a conclusion, I would like to say a couple of words that it is very interesting to hear in the questions that basically with one index or the 9 factors and the sub-factors, we are talking about the basic questions of politics and society and inequality. And so with one index, we try to solve all the problems that exist in the world, and it's very hard to do. And I think that you have done really an admirable job to include so many things. The other important element is the distinctions between the laws on the paper and how they are implemented. So this is why it is so important that the emphasis, I mean, it's very good to have laws, but really what matters is their implementation. And then also what you have raised related to the Caribbean, that you have to take it in your own hands to use this data, yeah? You know, some comparisons are provided, but you can use your own country data and compare it to whoever you want to, who you feel that is your comparator. And so do not expect everything from the project to be done, but be proactive and use the data to your advantage and for arguments in your countries, yeah, to advance the cause that relates to the rule of law. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much.